Hello, ladies and gentlemen. James here. I'm showing you the history of voting.
Thesis, the director informed him that the FBI had no records of any such investigation taking place in Ocoee in 1920. When Dabbs asked the Orange County Sheriff of the time, who had been a deputy in 1920, about the Ocoee massacre, the sheriff responded that, in his memory, no such event had taken place. Years passed and the memory of the massacre faded from the public consciousness, but the sundown town of Ocoee and its white residents remained. Florida continued to see its white population exert influence in the political, economic, and social spheres. The decades following the Ocoee riot saw the town struggle to get itself out of the financial disaster created by the mass exodus of much of the local population. Conditions started to improve by the time State Road 50 was constructed through Ocoee in 1959, but the racist attitudes that held sway over the town had hardly disappeared. Colonel Sam Salisbury, the leader of the lynch mob that killed July Perry, was elected as mayor of Ocoee through much of the 1950s, and it wasn't until the 1960s that the town's infamous sign warning "Dogs and Negroes Not Welcome" was removed. It could be argued that the tenure of Lester Dabbs Jr., first as city commissioner and then as mayor of Ocoee, helped improve the town's strained relationship with its own history, but even he had said to the Orlando Sentinel that the event should be left in the past. He was quickly replaced by Scott F. Vandergrift in 1992. Vandergrift had argued that Dabbs' thesis was poor and would go on to accuse the Democracy Forum, a group founded in Ocoee in the late 1990s dedicated to uncovering and spreading the truth about the Ocoee massacre, of looking to exploit something. Vandergrift was replaced in 2015 by current Ocoee Mayor Rusty Johnson, who has maintained the tradition of regarding those who seek information and accountability in relation to the Ocoee massacre as outsiders trying to dig up dirt. In 1920, the town claimed that it was outsiders who were responsible for the racial tensions spiraling out of control. In 2020, those in charge of the town still pointed the blame to outsiders, people they would claim aren't giving Ocoee and its residents a fair shake, and blaming it for a racial massacre that none of those currently living in the town were alive to see. When interviewed in late 2020 by a local news station, Mayor Johnson affirmed that he would not apologize for the events of 1920 personally or on behalf of the city, stating, "I told you I didn't do anything. I will say I am sorry for what happened. None of us were there. I wasn't there." Mayor Johnson's family first moved to Ocoee in 1955 during Sam Salisbury's years as mayor, back when the town still bore its "Dogs and Negroes Not Welcome" sign with pride. He acknowledged that Ocoee was an all-white town throughout much of his life, but still took offense to any suggestion that he and his wife were racist. His wife, whose maiden name was Marilyn Pounds, is the daughter of Edwin Pounds and the granddaughter of Clyde Pounds, the same deputy sheriff who took part in leading the lynch mob that killed July Perry. Mayor Johnson said that he was unaware of the family's connection to those events, as no one ever brought it up. Instead of outright accusing the mayor of racism, I would ask Mayor Johnson and his wife to think about the ways in which growing up in a town that was noticeably all white may have shaped their perceptions about what a community should look like and how it should function. In fact, I would challenge people across Florida and even across the United States to ask themselves that same question. Mayor Johnson's reaction is not a unique one and is incredibly common among white Americans. I've been guilty of a similar reaction myself whenever friends would link the violent state-sanctioned racism of the past with the conditions of the world today. Often my replies were along the lines of, "Well, yeah, all of that stuff was awful and I don't want it to happen again, but that all happened before my parents were even born. It wasn't my fault. What can I do about it?" The answer is that we can do something, anything, more than just sweeping it back under the rug like we've grown so dependent on doing since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. When we field accusations of systemic racism, which we all take part in, we need to challenge ourselves to look deeper. It's not that we're all evil, bad people who are itching to go join the next lynch mob. Those people still exist, but they're now a small minority. But even the most open-minded, loving white people in Florida still grew up in a community that had quite literally been shaped by racism in the decades prior. It is difficult, if not impossible, to spend your formative years in such an environment without it having some impact on your core beliefs about what your community should look like and what roles each demographic should play in it. Challenging your core beliefs is hard. It's really uncomfortable. It becomes unbearably uncomfortable when doing so would put you at the risk of falling into the category of racist and therefore make you a bad person. We want to think of ourselves as good people, and since racism is a characteristic normally attributed to bad people, we tend to hold "I am not racist in any way" as one of many core beliefs about ourselves. This often comes into conflict with other beliefs that we may come to hold subconsciously as a result of our environment, such as "it is normal for the community I live in to be mostly or entirely white," or "it is natural for politicians to be largely white and male." When changes occur that shift reality away from what we had come to know as normal, increased diversity in neighborhoods, the election of more women and people of color to government office, there is an unavoidable desire to right the world by making it return to what we knew before. This is done out of a need for consistency and comfort. Mankind has always been largely resistant to social change in the short term, and the modern era is no exception. What makes the modern day unique is that the public consciousness has shifted to a point where overt racism is no longer acceptable. This has led to the creation of a situation in which, in the desire for normalcy, we find ways to maintain the status quo, one that has been heavily shaped by America's history with racism, without admitting to the factor of race playing any part in the way we write laws, distribute wealth and resources, and arrange our communities. All Americans, white Americans in particular, have spent the last 50 years learning to suppress and ignore the cognitive dissonance that arises from proclaiming to live in a society that treats all people equally, regardless of race, gender, class, and sexuality, while that same society is visibly divided along those very same lines. When such an obvious contradiction is brought to our attention, we shut down. Our ability to see ourselves as good people who are therefore not racist depends on it. To admit that our current reality reflects the atrocities in our past would be admitting the need for significant and widespread changes to the way our society operates. This is a frightening prospect to many because we've never really tried it before in our lifetimes, and there's no way to know what it would look like or how it would affect our daily lives. There's just too much uncertainty involved, so it's easier to just keep things the way they are now. After all, we've come pretty far since the days of slavery and segregation, haven't we? Well, we have and we haven't. America has gradually walked away from more blatant violations of human rights like slavery and segregation, but these changes were never accompanied by an effective, widespread effort to make amends for the wrongs of the past. Rather, the agreement that these abuses would no longer be permitted by the law was seen as a sufficient compromise, allowing the government to pat itself on the back for its good deed, while the people of the country were left to decide what would happen on the local level. Local and state governments, particularly in the South, were often controlled by politicians who had actively opposed ending slavery or prohibiting segregation, and would spend the years following such major changes doing everything in their power to preserve the previous status quo. As we can see from the current disparities between races in things like wealth, access to healthcare, and education, as well as the segregation that is still present in many major cities in America, the status quo has remained largely intact. Despite all of this, we are living in an age of unprecedented progress. America's youngest generations have seen the rise of technology, particularly the internet, shape our childhoods and alter the way we think about our future. We've seen TVs and laptops go from fat to flat. We've watched cell phones change from clunky bricks to flip phones to the sleek standard accessory of the modern adult. We've seen accessing the internet shift from hogging the family phone line to being so widespread that you can do it from almost anywhere with no need for a wired connection. Working, banking, socializing, all of these things can be done virtually now. We have lived through so many of the biggest changes in human history that we sometimes forget just how monumental they are. It also makes it easier to ignore the changes we haven't been making. An racism and its lingering effects on our institutions is a long way away, but it is not impossible. It requires teamwork, sacrifice, and a collective desire to leave the world a more equal and peaceful place than we found it. This desire needs to be reflected in the way we organize our communities and shape our legal and financial systems. And to do that, we need to elect leaders who legislate based on a guiding principle of equality and dignity for all people. So, where are we at now? Out of curiosity, I decided to take a look at some of the powerful figures in Florida politics in 1920 and compare them to the powerful political figures in Florida today to see what kind of progress the state has made in the past century. Records were scarce on Florida's House and Senate leadership in 1920, but records on Florida's governors from the time were more complete. Florida's governor in the years leading up to 1910 was Democrat Napoleon B. Broward, for whom Broward County was named. Broward was an unashamed racist and segregationist who went so far as to suggest that the state and federal governments should purchase territory that could then be used to resettle the black population that would be forcibly removed from Florida. Years later, in 1920, our governor was Sidney Johnston Katz of the Prohibition Party, the son of a Confederate captain who combined his strong anti-Catholic sentiment with his even stronger racism to rile support from a conservative white base. He openly viewed black Floridians as an inferior race and responded to well-publicized lynchings by stating that only the vagrant, vagabond, worthless Negro is lynched. After the NAACP drew further attention to lynchings in Florida, he went so far as to declare, "Your race is always harping on the disgrace it brings to the state by a concourse of white people taking our revenge for the dishonoring of a white woman, when if you would teach your people to not kill our white officers and disgrace our white women, you would keep down 1,000 times greater disgrace." Katz's racism didn't just show in his words. It was a key component of his political platform from day one. In his inauguration speech, he proclaimed, "Your triumph is no less in this good hour, beautiful Florida, for you have withstood the onslaughts of the county and state political rings, the corporations, the railroads, the fierce opposition of the press and organization of the Negro voters of this state against you, and the power of the Roman Catholic hierarchy against you. Yet over all these, the common people of Florida, the everyday cracker people, have triumphed." Katz's populist rhetoric, the notion that he and his supporters represented the downtrodden, everyday people who were being persecuted by an assortment of state and private entities, bears a striking similarity to the kinds of speeches that Donald Trump used to win over Florida voters in the 2016 and 2020 United States presidential campaigns. The similarities between the two politicians don't end there. After his term as governor ended, Katz faced a number of personal and criminal scandals over his conduct in office. He was investigated for accepting bribes in exchange for pardons. The next month, a federal warrant was issued against him for the involuntary servitude of 2 black people forced to work on his plantation in northern Florida. He allegedly cried, "My enemies won't let me alone," when he was arrested, but later expressed confidence that he would be acquitted. He ultimately was acquitted by an all-white jury and went on to run 2 more failed political campaigns before being arrested once again, this time for his involvement in a plan to distribute $1 million in counterfeit money. That trial resulted in a mistrial, and ultimately Katz was acquitted once again. He returned to the comfort of his Sunbright plantation in Ufumiac Springs, where he died years later. In short, Katz was a con man and a criminal who consistently managed to weasel his way out of facing the consequences of his actions. To see how much progress Florida has made since then, I looked at our 2 most recent governors. Former governor and current Florida U.S. Senator Rick Scott's most notable achievement in his early career would probably be defrauding Medicare, Medicaid, and other federal programs for billions of dollars. He pled the Fifth Amendment over 75 times before hearing about his fraud case, and his company, Columbia HCA, was fined $1.7 billion in a healthcare fraud settlement that was the largest in U.S. history at the time. After departing from the company, Rick Scott used his leftover fraud money to start an investment business to make the kind of cash that gets you so rich that you never have to work again. Having freed up his work time for other pursuits, he then ran a high-dollar campaign for and won the office of Governor of Florida in 2010 and served until 2018. He knew better than to be openly racist, but anytime there was an issue on voting rights, he came down on the side of making voting more restrictive and less accessible. He also denied the reality of climate change and put significant restrictions on the ability of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to respond to climate change. This decision, while ultimately harmful to us all, will have a disproportionate negative impact on communities of color in Florida and around the world. He was an early supporter and frequent defender of Donald Trump from 2015 onward. Rick Scott was succeeded by Ron DeSantis, another enthusiastically pro-Trump Republican who sees himself as future United States president material. Not to be outdone by Barack Obama's 1995 memoir, Dreams from My Father, Ron DeSantis self-published the widely unread Dreams from Our Founding Fathers in 2011, just before a successful 2012 run for Florida's 6th congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. In his book, DeSantis argued that it was unfair to blame the Founding Fathers for allowing slavery in America and criticizes Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall for accusing the Founding Fathers of hypocrisy. He states that the Constitution was written in a way that made slavery designed to fail, and that the Three-Fifths Compromise directly benefited abolitionist states over slaveholding states. He used the rest of the book to criticize Obama's support of a UN convention dedicated to ending violence against women and said that Obama was showcasing his father's Muslim roots and his middle name of Hussein to pander to countries in the Middle East. As Rick Scott's second term drew to a close, DeSantis set his sights on the governor's office and prepared to take the next step in his political journey. He faced off against Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum in a contentious race that saw both men's integrity questioned in the public discourse. DeSantis took a lot of heat from the media when he claimed that Florida shouldn't monkey up this election by voting for Gillum in what was widely seen as a racist dog whistle to his supporters. DeSantis ultimately won a narrow victory and assumed his role as the governor of Florida, where he will likely remain through a second term. Governor DeSantis faced his first major public health crisis in the spring of 2020, as the United States became aware of the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic within its own borders. The federal government under then-President Donald Trump downplayed the severity of the pandemic and put up harsh resistance to any suggestions of nationwide lockdowns or mask mandates. DeSantis followed Trump's example and encouraged Floridians to take a business-as-usual approach to suppressing the pandemic, avoiding any public measures that might restrict Florida's tourism-dependent economy. Florida's case count and death toll rose steadily in the months that followed. When vaccines finally began to arrive in early 2021, DeSantis faced renewed criticism for allegedly focusing vaccine distribution in the wealthy, mostly white zip codes where his supporters and donors live, instead of focusing on the minority and low-income communities that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. He responded by warning local officials to not complain about his vaccine distribution if they wanted to receive their promised doses. DeSantis also attempted to govern through fear when he responded to the racial justice protests of the summer of 2020 with legislation that made it easier for police to arrest protesters for blocking traffic and withheld state funding from any local government that chose to cut its law enforcement budget. If we're judging based on state leadership in the early 1900s compared to now, Florida hasn't so much ended its love affair with racism as it has gotten. Black people are an inferior race at a press conference, but they will gladly support the abuse of black men and women in our criminal justice system, suppress black voters, and passively watch as communities of color bear the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic and its corresponding economic recession. They would never excuse lynchings the way Governor Katz did back in 1919, but they're also not going to fight for meaningful change in our social or economic structure. Ron DeSantis' idea of reaching out to Florida's black community is posthumously pardoning four black men who were accused of rape in 1949, and doing so only a few short months after winning his gubernatorial race against a black man by warning voters that his opponent would monkey things up if elected. Don't believe me? Listen to Ron himself talk about critical race theory and teaching it in Florida schools.
Florida civics curriculum will incorporate foundational concepts with the best materials, and it will expressly exclude unsanctioned narratives like critical race theory and other unsubstantiated theories. Let me be clear, there's no room in our classrooms for things like critical race theory. Teaching kids to hate their country and to hate each other is not worth 1 red cent of taxpayer money.
So Ron probably won't be showing this video or anything like it in Florida schools, which is pretty much par for the course from when I was still in Florida's public schools. Slavery and segregation are certainly covered in today's curriculum, but they are usually covered in a way that suggests that those issues took place in the past and were sufficiently dealt with in their time. We learn about those things as historical events, not as factors that continue to influence American society to this day. Harsh criticism of the Confederate States of America is generally avoided so as not to offend any students or parents who may have family ties to the Confederacy. As a result, we continue to perpetuate the half-truth that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, and not specifically over the state's right to continue the practice of slavery, as was expressed in many Confederate States' declarations of secession and subsequent constitutions. This carefully curated version of Florida's history is easily contradicted by historical documents and does not stand up to even mild scrutiny. Cherry-picking the least offensive parts of your state history to present to students might have worked in the 20th century, but the rise of the internet through the 21st century has made it easier for students to access a variety of sources and learn things about Florida's history that the state would prefer to be left in the dark. Conservatives like Ron DeSantis now have a difficult balancing act to maintain as the younger generation continues to skew progressive and demand more accountability from government. In 1920, the governor could be an outspoken racist without suffering any political consequences. Frankly, it probably would have helped his chances in the general election. In 2021, outspoken racism could drive away enough moderate voters to cost a candidate the election, so overt racism is no longer politically viable. To keep his base loyal and happy, Ron DeSantis needs to come up with policies that either help big businesses and wealthy donors or negatively impact people of color. The ideal policy accomplishes both, like his choice to focus vaccine distribution in wealthy white neighborhoods. The key to getting away with things like this is plausible deniability. It's important that race isn't mentioned at all in the policy, but that race does affect the way that the policy is implemented. These policies also deal significant harm to low-income white Floridians, but this side effect is usually overlooked by politicians and many of the affected citizens. On the rare occasion when public outcry over racism and Florida's history of racial violence is significant enough that the government is forced to act in some way, the goal is to offer acknowledgments, recognition, and small changes until the public is satisfied, while avoiding major changes to Florida's socioeconomic status quo. Malcolm X once famously said, "The white man will try to satisfy us with symbolic victories rather than economic equity and real justice." DeSantis' posthumous pardon of the Groveland Four is one such symbolic victory, but this behavior is hardly unique to Florida. The response by the federal and state governments and large corporations to the racial and social justice movement of the 2010s illustrates this phenomenon with painful clarity. American media makes a spectacle out of having more women and people of color in leadership roles, having more diverse casts in entertainment, and in making traditional underserved communities feel recognized. That's not to say that these things aren't good. They are good for society, but we ultimately do these communities a disservice when we stop there and don't look to take any further action when further action is clearly needed. Giving marginalized communities special recognition admits that we understand that these groups of people face unique challenges that often come from the government policies and social norms of our previous generations. What good is it to recognize these difficulties unless we are actively looking to remedy them? Acknowledging their existence while taking no meaningful action towards a solution suggests that we are fine with those challenges being there because they keep each group in their proper place in the social order. Nothing can be done that would significantly harm the interests of those at the top because they are where they belong, and so are you. The most we can offer is recognition. For a specific example of this, we can look at how the city of Ocoee and the state of Florida responded to a new awareness of the Ocoee massacre that grew over the past few decades as the 100-year anniversary of the event approached. The group Democracy Forum came to be in the late 1990s after Curtis Michelson helped Otis McCaster get a job working at a radio station in Ocoee. McCaster was followed by Ocoee police on his way to work for 3 consecutive nights before he abruptly quit, declaring, "Ocoee is not a place for a brother." This reaction left Michelson puzzled and concerned, and he ultimately joined with a few other local activists to form Democracy Forum. In searching to understand exactly why Ocoee was not a place for a brother, the group discovered new details about the town's history and the 1920 massacre that had spent 3 generations fading from memory. While the white community of Central Florida may have quickly forgotten the violence, the black community of Central Florida still knew Ocoee as a sundown town, somewhere you wouldn't want to be caught alone after dark. Through old newspapers, interviews with descendants of the victims, and public records that survived the attempted cover-up, Democracy Forum brought the nearly forgotten past back into the light. They were the first to discover the location of July Perry's unmarked grave in Greenwood Cemetery and finally added a headstone in 2002 with the help of Perry's family and the West Orange Reconciliation Task Force. The group has continued to raise awareness in the years since in an effort to transform Ocoee into a city capable of acknowledging and possibly even atoning for the racial brutality that shaped the town for a century. To their credit, Ocoee and the state of Florida have taken small steps in the right direction. In 2018, the Ocoee City Commission issued a formal proclamation that acknowledged the massacre as a defining event in the town's history. In 2020, Florida State Senator Randolph Bracy introduced a bill that would require the history of the Ocoee massacre to be taught in schools throughout the state. By arming the next generation with knowledge and history that has been kept from Floridians for decades, progressives hope to build a Florida for the future that can heal the deep racial wounds of the past. Actions like these are important first steps on the journey towards a compassionate, just, and integrated community. But will Florida continue to walk that path? Taking a closer look at Florida's history, it would seem that the state hasn't so much walked the path towards progress as it has been unwillingly dragged towards changes it would have happily avoided otherwise. In a society that adheres to the rule of law, the perpetrators of such a violent massacre would have been promptly arrested, put on trial, and imprisoned while local law enforcement worked to return stolen property and lost value to the victims. The Floridians of 1920 did the exact opposite of this. The crimes were covered up or ignored. The government and law enforcement across Central Florida did their best to wash their hands of the incident as soon as possible. Local newspapers like the Orlando Sentinel reported only the white casualties and insinuated that the black community had been responsible for the riot. The Floridians of today might be willing to admit that the Ocoee massacre happened and teach the history of it in schools, but according to the Florida government, they are just as committed as the Floridians of 1920 to ensuring that no economic justice will be delivered. The state legislature's response to the original version of Senator Bracy's education bill is incredibly telling. The original bill was intended to provide reparations, a dirty word in U.S. politics, especially in the South, for the descendants of the black residents of Ocoee who lost their property and livelihoods as a result of the massacre. During an interview with a local news station, Senator Bracy admitted that a leader in the Florida Senate had told him directly that they would support the educational portions of his bill, but that any attempts to financially repair the victims of the massacre would be dead on arrival. The bill passed without reparations, and the state congratulated itself for providing justice, and the Ocoee massacre faded back into the background as the news shifted to cover the never-ending emergency that had been the year 2020. After all, suffering in the present is more newsworthy than suffering in the past. But if we want to understand the pain being brought on by our present crises, then we need to have an honest relationship with our history and link the consequences of past actions to the circumstances we find ourselves in today. Systemic issues can only be dealt with in the present, no matter how deeply rooted they are in the past. In the fall of 1920, Ocoee was a growing, majority black community building its income through Central Florida's booming citrus trade. A handful of black citizens even owned their own land and were beginning to accumulate wealth that could be passed on to their children, offering a pathway into the middle class for families only a generation or two removed from slavery. If left alone, it's safe to assume that Ocoee's black community would have continued to prosper as residents increased their wealth and invested it back into their neighborhoods. Unfortunately, Ocoee's black community was not left alone. On November 2nd, 1920, they were driven from their burning homes and chased into the night by an armed mob, taking with them only what they could carry as they fled into the swamps. Those who weren't killed outright were forced to begin their lives anew in neighboring towns without a penny to their name. Even now, 100 years later, those families are still feeling the economic effects of their ancestors' displacement. The land that was illegally taken and resold has an estimated worth of about $9 million today. That's a lot of money that the families of the victims of the Ocoee massacre will likely never see. In a situation where true justice cannot be served, both the perpetrators and the victims of this massacre have long since passed away. The closest we can come to righting the wrongs of the past would be to financially repair the family. According to the Florida legislature, however, such action is not even up for debate. Now, even though I want to assume that the state of Florida's history of racism and Confederate sympathy is what's getting in the way of reparations, I want to give my home state the benefit of the doubt and look at things from a purely economic standpoint. Senator Bracey's bill intended to create a $10 million fund for the state to pay reparations to the descendants of the victims of Ocoee. The state of Florida's proposed budget for 2021 came in at $91.4 billion, so the reparations fund would account for approximately 0.01% of that. $10 million is no small sum of money, but it's pocket change when compared to the overall state budget. The real problem with acknowledging that reparations are necessary in the wake of the Ocoee massacre is that it starts a conversation that the state of Florida really doesn't want to have, even though we've technically already had it before with Rosewood. If Ocoee were to follow Rosewood in the creation of a compensation fund for victims of racial violence, that would start a pattern, and Florida would see other towns with violent past like Elfers or Southport being held accountable for their own crimes. Many of these are small towns that wouldn't be able to provide the funds for reparations on their own, so the financial responsibility would end up falling to the state of Florida. From there, the state can either decline to provide reparations and deny justice, provide reparations and take on the economic strain of their implementation, or try to pass the responsibility up one level higher to the United States government. In that case, there would be at least 40 other states with their sundown towns and histories of racial violence that would be furious with Florida for taking the issue of reparations to the national stage and opening them up to greater scrutiny. When Senator Bracey gave the Florida legislature a chance to do the right thing by providing compensation to the descendants of the victims of the Ocoee massacre, the legislature chose instead to deny justice. It is up to us to change their mind. So how do we convince the Florida government that reparations are necessary? To me, there seem to be two main ways to go about this: lobbying the politicians directly and reaching out to the people of Florida themselves. Lobbying politicians directly would probably be the fastest route to change, but lobbying requires money, usually lots of it. Since this particular situation involves families that were deprived of their wealth through violent terrorism, money for this cause is hard to come by. The more negatively a family was affected by the massacre, the less likely their descendants would be to have the money for political lobbying or legal representation. By comparison, those who participated in
The purpose of this law is simple. It does not restrict the freedom of any American, so long as he respects the rights of others. It does not give special treatment to any citizen. It does say the only limit to a man's hope for happiness and for the future of his children shall be his own ability. It does say that there are those who are equal before God shall now also be equal in the polling booths, in the classrooms, in the factories, and in hotels and restaurants and movie theaters.
Some things never change. Some things in America never change. It's the same old thing. St. DeSantis. See, America, some things they won't repair for the evil that we've done.
In the massacre got to keep their wealth and added to it through the illegal sales of the stolen property, setting up their descendants to have easy access to wealth and credit and giving them the potential to have a much greater say in Florida's future politics. Sam Salisbury did well enough for himself to become mayor of Ocoee and live comfortably until he died. He never went to jail for his crimes, and the only people who ever were arrested in relation to the massacre were July Perry and his wife and daughter after they fled to Tampa. Former Confederate Captain Bluford M. Sims was responsible for the sale of a number of stolen plots of lands, one of which likely belonged to the recently killed Perry. Bluford Sims was an influential founding member of the Ocoee community and had been hired as the teacher at the first school in Apopka, giving him the opportunity to warp hundreds of children's understanding of Florida's history and lay the groundwork for Ocoee to eventually become a sundown town. The road that runs past City Hall and Stark Lake in Ocoee is named Bluford Avenue in his honor, so that the townspeople of Ocoee can still remember him today. The old and new collide often in Ocoee, as they do across Florida and in towns across the United States, but these collisions are easily missed. If you visit the former site of the A&E Church, it looks like just another intersection in a web of streets and suburbs that grows by the year. July Perry's former property is now just another stretch of brush waiting to be cleared along Apopka-Ocoee Road, though a barbed wire fence now separates passerby from what was once a refuge for travelers in need. James and Annie Hameter's former property is used as a dump for plant waste, and Mose Norman's former property is now occupied by a construction business. These are the sorts of ties to history that you have to go looking for, but some of Ocoee's connections to the past are more readily visible in the modern day. It's easy to see new $50,000 trucks rolling past houses that look like they've been there since cars were invented. It's hard to take a look at Ocoee as an outsider and gain a true understanding of how Ocoee's violent transformation into a sundown town shaped the town and its people over the next 100 years. But it's clear that the Ocoee Massacre was the defining event in the town's history despite being ignored for decades. This is why I think that Floridians who seek justice and change will have to do the long, hard work of reaching out to the people of Florida and having an honest discussion about our state's history and how it should affect our future. The pay-to-play route of political lobbying might be easier and faster, but changing the hearts and minds of the people is the foundation of lasting change. Lasting change is what Florida needs.
Well, that's the man that lost his life, the black man. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's part of American history that people like Ron DeSantis don't want the future generations to know. That this is what happened in Florida and in other places, but that's just one of many laws. So, I hope there's been education to you, and the one was on the government site that showed that even up until 2000 there was discrimination. So it's a history that goes back way beyond time. That's why I said they don't want to let it go. Some places don't want to let racism go. Even when it comes to voting. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and upload this. Until next time, you guys. Sorry, I dropped my tablet just to show it. All right then, you guys take it easy. Till next time, y'all be blessed.